My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you about the most difficult decision I've ever made in my life. It's a story about family, betrayal, and a mother's will that would have destroyed everything we had worked for. I'm sharing this because I know many of you might face similar situations. And maybe my experience can help you understand what it's really like when family bonds are tested by money and legal documents. It was a cold Tuesday morning in October 2023 when I found myself sitting in my mother's empty house in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. The smell of her lavender candles still lingered in the air, mixing with the musty scent of unopened rooms. Mom had passed away just 2 weeks earlier after a brief battle with pneumonia, and as the eldest of 4 children, I had taken on the responsibility of handling her affairs. The house felt enormous without her presence. Every corner held memories: the kitchen where she taught me to make her famous apple pie, the living room where we'd watch old movies together, the garden where she spent countless hours tending to her roses. But today, I wasn't here to reminisce. I was here to find her will. And what I discovered would haunt me for months to come. I had been searching through her bedroom dresser when my fingers found a manila envelope tucked behind some old photo albums. The envelope was sealed and marked, "Last Will and Testament of Margaret Elizabeth Chen," in my mother's careful handwriting. My heart raced as I held it in my trembling hands. This was it. The document that would determine how our family's future would unfold. You have to understand, my relationship with my siblings had always been complicated. There was me, Sarah, 38, a high school teacher who had stayed close to home to help care for Mom. Then there was Michael, 35, a successful lawyer in Chicago who visited maybe twice a year. Jessica, 32, lived in Los Angeles pursuing her acting career, always asking Mom for money to support her next big break. And finally, there was David, 29, who had struggled with addiction for years and had been in and out of rehabilitation centers. As I carefully opened the envelope, sitting on Mom's floral bedspread, I remember thinking about how she had always been fair with us kids. Even when money was tight after Dad died 10 years ago, she made sure we all felt equally loved and supported. That's why what I read next completely shattered my understanding of the woman who raised me. The will was dated just 6 months before her death, and as I read through the legal language, my stomach dropped. According to this document, Mom was leaving the house, our childhood home worth nearly $400,000, entirely to David. Not split among the 4 of us, not even given primarily to him with some provisions for the rest of us. The entire property, along with 60% of her savings, was going to my youngest brother. The reasoning, as stated in the will, was that David needed the most help and support. She wrote that she hoped the security of owning the home and having financial resources would help him maintain his sobriety and build a stable life. Michael would receive 20% of the remaining assets due to his financial success. Jessica would get 15%. And me, the daughter who had spent the last 5 years driving Mom to doctor's appointments, grocery shopping with her, and spending every Sunday afternoon in her company, I was getting 5% and a few pieces of jewelry. I sat there on that bed, staring at the papers, feeling like I couldn't breathe. The injustice of it burned in my chest. While David was struggling with his demons, I had sacrificed so much to be there for Mom. I had turned down a promotion that would have required relocating to Denver because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone. I had spent my savings helping with her medical bills when Medicare didn't cover everything. I had been the one holding her hand in the hospital during her final days. And this was how she repaid my devotion? The rational part of my mind tried to understand her reasoning. Mom had always felt guilty about David's struggles, often blaming herself for not recognizing the signs of his addiction earlier. She had bailed him out of financial trouble countless times, paid for 3 different rehabilitation programs, and genuinely believed that stability and security might be the key to his recovery. But the emotional part of me, the part that had put my own life on hold to care for her, felt completely betrayed. How could she not see that David would likely squander this inheritance just like he had squandered every other opportunity she had given him? How could she not recognize that I was the one who truly deserved this security? As I sat there in the fading afternoon light, still holding those damning papers, I made a decision that would change everything. I folded the will carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in my purse. Then, I continued my search through Mom's belongings, acting as if I had never found anything at all. When Michael arrived from Chicago that evening to help with the estate planning, I greeted him at the door with what I hoped was a normal expression. He was dressed in his typical expensive suit, checking his phone every few minutes for important messages from his law firm. Despite being a lawyer, Michael specialized in corporate law, not estate planning. So he had recommended we hire a probate attorney to handle Mom's affairs. "Did you find her will yet?" he asked, barely looking up from his phone as he loosened his tie. "Not yet," I lied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I've been through most of her papers, but you know how Mom was about organization. It could be anywhere." Jessica arrived the next day, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the long flight from Los Angeles. She seemed more concerned about whether Mom had left any valuable jewelry than about the actual legal proceedings. "I just think it's important that we each get something meaningful to remember her by," she said, examining Mom's collection of vintage brooches. David was the last to arrive, looking healthier than he had in years. He had been clean for 8 months, the longest stretch in over a decade. And there was a clarity in his eyes that I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. Part of me felt guilty for what I was planning, seeing how hard he was trying to rebuild his life. But the larger part of me remained convinced that this inheritance would only enable him to relapse. "I can't believe she's really gone," David said quietly, as we sat around Mom's kitchen table, sorting through old family photos. "I keep thinking I should call her to tell her about my job interview next week." He had been working at a local auto repair shop and was hoping to get promoted to assistant manager. It was honest work, and I was proud of him for sticking with it. But in my mind, that just proved my point. He was finally learning to be self-sufficient. Why would Mom want to disrupt that progress by giving him a massive windfall? Over the next few days, the 4 of us worked together to prepare for what we assumed would be a straightforward probate process. Since we couldn't locate Mom's will, her estate would be distributed according to Ohio's intestacy laws, which meant everything would be split equally among the 4 of us. Michael explained that without a will, the house and savings would be divided into 4 equal shares, which seemed fair to everyone. But as I watched my siblings making plans for their portions of the inheritance, Michael talking about investment strategies, Jessica dreaming about using her share to fund an independent film, David quietly mentioning that he might use his portion to go back to school, I felt the weight of the secret I was carrying. Every night I went home to my small apartment and stared at that envelope sitting on my kitchen counter. I had hidden it behind some cookbooks, but I knew exactly where it was every moment of every day. Sometimes I would take it out and read through it again, hoping I had misunderstood something, hoping there was some provision I had missed that would make the distribution more equitable. But there wasn't. The will was clear, and it was devastating. The weeks passed, and we began the process of putting Mom's affairs in order without a will. The probate attorney Michael had hired, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, explained that the process would take several months, but that ultimately each of us would inherit an equal share of Mom's estate, which was valued at approximately $650,000, including the house. "Your mother was very organized with her finances," Mrs. Rodriguez told us during our initial meeting at her downtown Cleveland office. "She had excellent records, and most of her assets are easily divisible. The only challenge will be deciding what to do with the family home." We had already discussed this as siblings. None of us could afford to buy out the other's shares, and none of us really wanted to live in the suburban house where we had grown up. We agreed that selling it and splitting the proceeds 4 ways made the most sense. even though it broke my heart to think of strangers living in the place where I had so many precious memories with Mom. But as we sat in that lawyer's office, making plans based on information that I knew to be incomplete, the guilt was eating me alive. I watched David taking careful notes about the timeline and legal requirements, treating this responsibility with a seriousness that surprised me. I saw Jessica actually paying attention instead of scrolling through her phone. I noticed Michael putting aside his work calls to focus on family business. Maybe Mom's will would have torn us apart. Maybe David would have relapsed under the pressure of suddenly having so much wealth and responsibility. Maybe Jessica and Michael and I would have spent years resenting both him and Mom's memory. Maybe this secret I was keeping was actually protecting our family from a devastating fracture. Or maybe I was just trying to justify the unjustifiable. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made another decision that would prove to be even more consequential than the first. I wasn't just going to hide Mom's will forever. I was going to challenge it in court. I was going to prove that she wasn't in her right mind when she wrote it, that someone had influenced her unfairly, or that there was some legal technicality that would invalidate the document. I was going to fight for what I believed I deserved, even if it meant deceiving my siblings and potentially destroying our family relationships forever. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I told myself I was protecting everyone, protecting David from a burden he couldn't handle, protecting Jessica and Michael from the heartbreak of learning how little Mom had valued them, and protecting myself from a lifetime of financial struggle and emotional resentment. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was about to embark on a path that would test every moral boundary I had ever set for myself, and I wasn't sure I would recognize the person I would become by the end of it. 3 weeks had passed since I found Mom's will, and the weight of my secret was becoming unbearable. Every conversation with my siblings felt like walking through a minefield. Every meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez, our probate attorney, required me to maintain a performance that was exhausting my soul. But I had committed to this path, and there was no turning back now. I had spent those 3 weeks researching everything I could about will contests in Ohio. Late at night, after grading papers and preparing lesson plans, I would sit at my laptop diving deep into legal precedents, reading about cases where wills had been successfully challenged. I learned about terms like undue influence, lack of mental capacity, and fraud, studying each one like I was preparing for the most important test of my life. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I had a case. Mom had been on several medications in her final months, including some that could cause confusion or disorientation. She had been grieving the loss of her best friend, Eleanor, who had died just 2 months before Mom wrote this will, and David had been calling her more frequently during that period, ostensibly to update her on his recovery progress. But what if he had been manipulating her emotions? I know how this sounds. I know it seems like I was grasping at straws, trying to build a case out of nothing. But when you're watching your siblings plan their futures based on what they believe will be an equal inheritance, when you're sitting in meetings discussing the sale of your childhood home, as if you have an equal say in the matter, when you're watching David's eyes light up as he talks about using his share to finally get his life on track, well, desperation can make you rationalize almost anything. The breakthrough came during our second meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez. We were sitting in her office on a gray November morning, the 4 of us arranged around her conference table like we were negotiating a business deal rather than mourning our mother. Mrs. Rodriguez was explaining the timeline for the probate process when she mentioned something that made my heart skip a beat. "I did want to ask you all again about your mother's will," she said, looking at each of us in turn. "It's unusual for someone as organized as your mother to not have a will, especially given her age and the value of her estate. Are you absolutely certain you've searched everywhere?" Michael shifted in his seat. "We've been through all her papers multiple times. If there was a will, we would have found it." "Sometimes people keep important documents in safety deposit boxes," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested. "Or with a previous attorney. Your mother never mentioned having legal work done? This was it. This was my opening. Actually, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I did remember something. About 6 months before she died, Mom mentioned that she had been thinking about updating her will. She said something about wanting to make sure David was taken care of because of his situation. David looked uncomfortable, and I immediately felt guilty for bringing up his addiction in front of the lawyer. But I pressed on. She never said she had actually done it, but maybe we should check with some local attorneys? See if she had consulted with anyone? Mrs. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's an excellent idea. If she did have a will drafted, we need to locate it before we can proceed with the intestacy distribution. I volunteered to make the calls to local law offices, knowing that this would give me more time to develop my strategy. Over the next week, I called dozens of attorneys in the Cleveland area, asking if Margaret Chen had been a client. It was tedious work, but it also gave me the perfect excuse for why I was spending so much time researching legal matters. During this time, I also began documenting everything I could remember about Mom's final months. I started a notebook where I recorded every conversation I could recall, every instance where she seemed confused or upset, every time David had called or visited. I was building a case file, gathering ammunition for a battle that my siblings didn't even know was coming. The most challenging part was maintaining normal relationships with my brothers and sister. David, in particular, was going through a really positive phase in his recovery. He had gotten the promotion at the auto shop and was talking about enrolling in community college courses. He would call me every few days to share good news or ask for advice, and each conversation felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Sarah, I know this is weird to say, he told me during one of these calls, but losing Mom has actually motivated me to keep getting better. I keep thinking about how proud she would be if she could see me now, you know? Like, maybe her death wasn't completely meaningless if it helps me finally get my life together. The irony was almost unbearable. David was finding strength and purpose in Mom's memory, using her death as motivation to continue his sobriety and build a stable future. And here I was, plotting to reveal that she had actually wanted to give him everything, which would either devastate him with guilt or potentially trigger a relapse. But I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on my research. I had contacted a different attorney, someone Mrs. Rodriguez had never worked with, and scheduled a consultation under the pretense of getting a second opinion about the estate process. Her name was Catherine Marsh, and she specialized in will contests. Ms. Marsh's office was in a renovated Victorian house in Cleveland Heights, and everything about her presence conveyed competence and confidence. She was probably in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel like she could see right through any deception. So, you believe your mother may have had a will that was either destroyed or hidden, she said, reviewing the notes I'd given her. And you suspect that your brother may have exerted undue influence over her in her final months. I'm not saying David did anything intentionally wrong, I lied. But he was calling her a lot, and she was very emotional about his recovery. She always felt guilty about his addiction, like it was somehow her fault. If he was sharing details about his struggles, his fears about relapsing, his need for stability, I could see how that might influence her to want to provide for him more than the rest of us. Ms. Marsh nodded thoughtfully. Undue influence cases can be challenging to prove, but they're not impossible. We would need to demonstrate that your brother had a confidential relationship with your mother, that he had the opportunity to exert influence, that he was inclined to do so, and that the will represents an unnatural disposition of her assets. She explained that Ohio law requires clear and convincing evidence of undue influence, which is a high standard. But she also mentioned that if we could locate the will, we might find other grounds for challenging it: improper witnessing, lack of mental capacity, or fraud. The first step would be to conduct a thorough search, she said. If you truly believe a will exists, we can petition the court to compel your brother to produce any documents in his possession. We can also subpoena local attorneys and banks to determine if your mother had any recent legal consultations or safety deposit boxes. I left that meeting with my head spinning. Ms. Marsh was clearly capable of mounting a serious legal challenge, but she was also expensive. Her retainer fee alone was $10,000, with additional costs for investigation, expert witnesses, and trial preparation if necessary. I was a high school teacher with modest savings, and I would need to be absolutely certain of my case before committing to that kind of financial investment. That weekend, I found myself back at Mom's house, ostensibly helping Jessica sort through personal belongings, but actually conducting my own investigation. I searched every room again, looking for any evidence that might support my theory about David's influence or Mom's mental state. In her bedroom closet, I found a small stack of greeting cards that David had sent her over the past year. Most were simple thinking of you cards or thank you notes for small gifts of money she had sent him. But one, dated just 3 months before her death, was different. "Dear Mom," it read in David's careful handwriting, "I know I've let you down so many times, and I know how much you worry about what will happen to me when you're gone. I want you to know that I'm working really hard to become the son you always believed I could be. I promise I won't waste the opportunities you've given me. Love, David." I stared at that card for a long time, trying to decide what it meant. Was this evidence of manipulation? A calculated attempt to play on Mom's emotions and influence her estate planning? Or was it simply a genuine expression of love and gratitude from a son who was trying to rebuild his relationship with his mother? The truth was, I wasn't sure. And that uncertainty was making everything more complicated. Jessica appeared in the doorway, holding a box of old photo albums. "Find anything interesting?" she asked. I quickly put the card back where I found it. Just some old birthday cards, nothing important. "I still can't believe Mom didn't leave a will," Jessica said, settling down beside me on the bed. "She was so careful about everything else. Remember how she used to balance her checkbook to the penny every month? Maybe she thought she had more time," I said. "Maybe she was planning to do it and just ran out of time," Jessica nodded sadly. I keep thinking about our last conversation. She called me 2 weeks before she went into the hospital, and she sounded so worried about David. She kept asking if I thought he was really okay this time, if I believed he would stay clean. I told her yes because that's what she wanted to hear, but honestly, I wasn't sure. This conversation with Jessica planted a new seed of doubt in my mind. What if Mom's will wasn't the result of manipulation or diminished capacity? What if it was simply the desperate decision of a mother who was running out of time and wanted to ensure her most vulnerable child would be protected? But then I thought about my own sacrifices, my own devotion, my own financial struggles. I thought about the promotion I had turned down, the relationship I had ended because my boyfriend didn't understand why I spent so much time caring for Mom, the retirement savings I had depleted helping with her medical expenses. Didn't that devotion count for something? Didn't that sacrifice deserve recognition? As November turned into December, the probate process continued moving forward. Mrs. Rodriguez had filed the necessary paperwork to begin intestacy proceedings, and we were making plans for putting the house on the market in the spring. David had even suggested that we use some of the proceeds to set up a small scholarship fund in Mom's name at the local high school, where she had volunteered for years. She would have loved that, I said, and I meant it. Mom had always valued education and would have been thrilled to know that her legacy was helping students pursue their dreams. But even as I participated in these family planning sessions, I was continuing my secret consultations with Ms. Marsh. She had agreed to conduct a preliminary investigation for a reduced fee, which would involve checking with local attorneys and financial institutions to see if Mom had created any legal documents in her final months. If we find evidence, that a will exists, she explained. Then we can decide how to proceed. But I want to be clear about something, Sarah. Will contests are emotionally devastating for families. Even if we win, the relationships with your siblings may never recover. Are you prepared for that possibility? I told her I was, but the truth was more complicated. I was prepared to risk everything for what I believed was justice, but I wasn't prepared for the guilt that was consuming me day by day. Every time David called to share good news about his job, every time Jessica sent photos of her latest audition, every time Michael included me in family group texts about holiday plans, I felt like I was living a lie. The breaking point came during our family Christmas gathering at Michael's house in Chicago. We had decided to spend the holiday together, the first Christmas since Mom's death, and everyone was making an effort to create new traditions while honoring her memory. David gave each of us a framed photo of Mom from her garden, along with handwritten notes about specific memories he treasured. Jessica had compiled a playlist of all Mom's favorite songs. Michael had arranged for a video call with some of Mom's old friends who couldn't be there in person. And me? I sat there with a smile plastered on my face, participating in this beautiful memorial to our mother, while knowing that I was planning to shatter our family's peace with a legal battle that might destroy us all. That night, lying in Michael's guest room, I stared at my phone for hours. Catherine Marsh's number pulled up on the screen. I could call her right now and tell her I had changed my mind, that I wanted to withdraw from any investigation. I could destroy Mom's will and let the equal distribution proceed as planned. I could choose family harmony over what I believed was justice. But then I thought about that 5% inheritance, about watching David receive 60% of everything while I got almost nothing despite years of devoted care. I thought about my modest teacher's salary and my empty retirement account and my uncertain future, and I made the call that would change everything. Ms. Marsh, it's Sarah Chen. I've made my decision. I want to move forward with the full investigation. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I need to find that will and challenge it. I understand, she said quietly. We'll begin immediately after the new year. But Sarah, once we start this process, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, glittering in the winter darkness, and thought about all the decisions that had led me to this moment. Yes, I said, I'm certain. But even as I spoke those words, I knew that certainty was the one thing I was anything but. January 2024 arrived with a bitter, cold snap that seemed to mirror the chill settling over my conscience. While my siblings were making New Year's resolutions and moving forward with their lives, I was embarking on a secret mission that would either vindicate my actions or destroy everything I held dear. Catherine Marsh wasted no time beginning her investigation. Within the first week of January, her office had sent formal requests to every law firm in the greater Cleveland area, inquiring about any legal services provided to Margaret Elizabeth Chen in the final year of her life. They also submitted requests to local banks for information about safety deposit boxes and recent changes to any accounts. I had taken a leave of absence from teaching, telling the principal I needed time to handle family estate matters. This wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I needed the flexibility to participate in this investigation without my siblings becoming suspicious about my activities. The first break came on January 15th. Ms. Marsh called me with news that made my heart race and my stomach drop simultaneously. Sarah, we found something, she said. Thompson and Associates, a small firm in Lakewood, confirmed that your mother was a client. She came in last April to draft a new will. I gripped the phone tighter. Did they say anything about the contents? Attorney-client privilege prevents them from sharing details, but they confirmed the will was completed and properly executed. The attorney, James Thompson, remembered your mother because she was very emotional during their meetings. He said she seemed conflicted about her decisions, but was ultimately determined to proceed. This was it. This was the proof I needed that the will existed and that Mom had been emotionally compromised when she created it. But instead of feeling vindicated, I felt nauseated. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We petitioned the probate court to compel production of the will. Since you're already involved in the intestacy proceedings, we can file a motion claiming that important estate documents may exist and need to be located before distribution can proceed." Within days, Ms. Marsh had filed the necessary paperwork. Mrs. Rodriguez, our family's probate attorney, called me immediately after receiving the court documents. "Sarah, I'm confused," she said. "Why are you working with another attorney to search for your mother's will? And why didn't you discuss this with your siblings first?" I had prepared for this moment, but it was still terrifying. I've been doing some research on my own, and I found evidence that Mom might have consulted with other attorneys. I thought it was worth investigating before we finalize everything. I didn't want to get everyone's hopes up if it turned out to be nothing. But this petition is going to trigger a formal investigation. The court will require all family members to participate. Your siblings are going to find out about this today. My phone started ringing within hours. First Michael, then Jessica, then David. Each conversation was more difficult than the last. Michael was furious. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? I just got a call from Rodriguez saying you've hired another lawyer and filed some kind of motion. We're supposed to be working together on this." I tried to explain about the evidence I had found, about my suspicions that Mom had created a will we hadn't located. But Michael, being a lawyer himself, immediately understood the implications. If Mom had a will and it's substantially different from intestacy distribution, this could change everything, he said. "Why didn't you come to us first? Why are you going behind our backs?" Jessica was hurt more than angry. "I don't understand, Sarah. We're family. If you thought there might be a will, why wouldn't you tell us? What are you so afraid of?" But it was David's call that nearly broke my resolve. His voice was quiet and confused. "Sarah, I keep thinking about what this means. If Mom did have a will and she chose not to tell me about it, what if she left me out completely? What if she finally gave up on me?" "David, no," I said, my heart breaking. "Mom never gave up on you. She was so proud of your recovery. But you must have some reason to think the will might be different from what we're expecting. Otherwise, why would you hire a lawyer? Are you trying to protect me from something, or are you trying to protect yourself?" I couldn't answer him honestly, so I gave him the same story I had given the others. But his question haunted me. Was I protecting anyone, or was I simply protecting my own interests? The court hearing was scheduled for February 8th. In the weeks leading up to it, Ms. Marsh and I prepared extensively. She had subpoenaed Thompson and Associates for the will, and we would finally see the document that had been consuming my thoughts for months. But she also wanted to prepare for the possibility that we would need to challenge the will's validity. This meant gathering evidence about Mom's mental state, David's relationship with her, and any circumstances that might have influenced her decisions. "I need you to think carefully about the last 6 months of your mother's life," Ms. Marsh said during one of our preparation sessions. "Any changes in her behavior, any new medications, any unusual conversations or decisions. I also need a detailed timeline of David's interactions with her." This was the most morally complicated part of the entire process. I was being asked to build a case against my own brother, to document every conversation and visit in a way that would paint him as manipulative rather than loving. I was being asked to analyze my mother's final months for signs of weakness rather than wisdom. I created the timeline Ms. Marsh requested, but every entry felt like a betrayal. March 15th, David called Mom to tell her about getting the job at the auto shop. She was excited and cried happy tears. Could this be spun as emotional manipulation? April 2nd, David visited Mom and helped her plant flowers in the garden. They talked about his recovery and his hopes for the future. Was this evidence of undue influence? The more I documented, the clearer it became that David's relationship with Mom in her final months had been genuinely loving and supportive. He had been sharing his progress, asking for her advice, and including her in his recovery journey. There was nothing sinister or calculated about their interactions. But I had come too far to turn back now. On February 7th, the day before the hearing, Ms. Marsh received the will from Thompson and Associates. She called me immediately. "Sarah, I need you to come to my office right away. We need to discuss the contents of this will before tomorrow's hearing." I drove to her office through a snowstorm, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. This was the moment of truth. In a few minutes, I would officially learn what I'd known for months, and I would have to react with appropriate surprise and shock. Ms. Marsh's expression was grave as she handed me the will. "I want you to read this carefully, and then we need to talk about our options." I opened the document and pretended to read it for the first time. The distribution was exactly as I remembered. The house and 60% of the savings to David, 20% to Michael, 15% to Jessica, and 5% plus some jewelry to me. But there was also a letter attached, one I hadn't seen in the original document I had found. The letter was addressed to all four of us, and it explained Mom's reasoning in her own words. "My dearest children, I know this distribution may seem unfair, and I want you to understand my reasoning. Sarah, my devoted daughter, you have given me so much love and support in these final years. The jewelry I'm leaving you includes pieces from your grandmother that I know you treasure, and I hope you understand that your reward has been the time we've spent together and the relationship we've built. Michael and Jessica, you have both built successful, independent lives, and I am so proud of what you've accomplished. The financial gifts I'm leaving you are tokens of my love, but I know you don't need my money to be happy and secure. David, my darling boy, I'm giving you the house and the larger financial gift because I worry about your future in a way I don't worry about your siblings. This is not because I love you more, but because I fear for you more. I pray that this inheritance will give you the security and stability you need to continue your recovery and build the life I know you're capable of living. Please don't let my decisions divide you. You are each other's greatest treasures, and that is the most important legacy I can leave behind." Reading Mom's letter again in an official setting, surrounded by legal documents and court filings, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. Mom hadn't been manipulated or coerced. She hadn't been suffering from diminished capacity. She had made a conscious, loving decision based on her assessment of each of her children's needs and circumstances, and I was about to tear that decision apart in court. The letter makes a will contest more challenging, Ms. Marsh said carefully. It demonstrates clear thinking and rational decision-making, but we still have grounds to argue undue influence, particularly given the timing of the will's creation and your brother's increased contact with your mother during that period. "What are our chances?" I asked. "Honestly, maybe 30%. The will is properly executed. Your mother clearly states her reasoning, and there's no obvious evidence of coercion. But juries are unpredictable, and if we can present a compelling narrative about your brother's influence and your mother's emotional vulnerability, we might succeed." That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at a photo of my family from last Christmas, the last Christmas with Mom. We were all crowded around her in her living room, laughing at something David had said, looking like the close, loving family we'd always been. Tomorrow, I would walk into a courtroom and potentially destroy that forever. I picked up my phone to call Ms. Marsh and tell her I had changed my mind. I could claim that seeing the will had convinced me of its validity, that I no longer wanted to pursue a contest. I could withdraw from this process and accept Mom's decision, even if it meant sacrificing my financial security. But then I thought about my empty retirement account, about the promotion I had turned down, about all the sacrifices I had made. I thought about David's history of poor decisions and the likelihood that he would squander this inheritance. I thought about the unfairness of receiving only 5% when I had been the most devoted child, and I set the phone down without making the call. The next morning, I put on my best suit and drove to the courthouse, ready to fight for what I believed I deserved, regardless of what it might cost my family. But as I walked up the courthouse steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. February 8th, 2024. The date is burned into my memory like a scar. I walked into that courthouse in downtown Cleveland, carrying the weight of months of deception, knowing that the next few hours would either vindicate my actions or expose me as the calculating person I had become. The probate courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. My siblings were already there when I arrived, sitting together on one side with Mrs. Rodriguez. The physical distance between us seemed symbolic of the chasm I had created through my secrecy. Michael looked at me with a mixture of anger and confusion. He had flown in from Chicago specifically for this hearing, canceling important meetings because he still didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. Jessica kept glancing at me with hurt in her eyes, clearly feeling betrayed by my decision to hire my own attorney without consulting the family. But it was David who looked the most devastated. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor like he was preparing himself for the worst possible news. Judge Patricia Hawkins entered the courtroom at exactly 9 a.m., her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression suggesting she had little patience for family drama. She had been handling probate cases for over 20 years, and I imagined she had seen every possible variation of inheritance disputes and sibling conflicts. "This is a petition to compel production of estate documents," she began, looking at the paperwork in front of her. "Ms. Chen, you're claiming that your mother may have executed a will that hasn't been disclosed to the court or to your siblings. Is that correct?" Ms. Marsh stood to address the court. "Yes, Your Honor. We have evidence that the decedent consulted with Thompson and Associates in April 2023 and executed a will at that time. We believe this document should be produced and evaluated before any intestacy distribution proceeds." Mrs. Rodriguez rose to respond. "Your Honor, the family has conducted a thorough search of the decedent's personal effects and found no will. If such a document exists, we would ask why Ms. Sarah Chen chose to pursue this investigation independently rather than working with her siblings and their chosen counsel." That question hung in the air like an accusation. Judge Hawkins looked directly at me, her piercing gaze making me feel like she could see through every lie I had told over the past months. "Ms. Chen, why didn't you discuss your suspicions with your family before filing this petition?" I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. This was the moment where I had to sell my performance, where months of deception would either pay off or crumble around me. "Your Honor, I wasn't certain that a will existed, and I didn't want to cause unnecessary distress to my family if my suspicions were unfounded. I felt it was better to investigate quietly and only involve them if I found concrete evidence." It was a reasonable explanation, but I could see the skepticism in Judge Hawkins's eyes. She had probably heard similar justifications from other family members who were pursuing secret agendas in inheritance disputes. "Mr. Thompson from Thompson and Associates is here to produce the will," she said. "Let's see what we're dealing with before we proceed further." James Thompson was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of measured demeanor that suggested he had spent decades handling sensitive family matters. He approached the bench carrying a manila envelope that looked identical to the one I had hidden in my apartment for months. "Your Honor, I can confirm that Margaret Chen was my client and that she executed a will on April 18th, 2023. The will was properly witnessed and notarized according to Ohio law." Judge Hawkins examined the document, her expression remaining neutral as she read through Mom's final wishes. Finally, she looked up at all of us. "I'm going to read the relevant portions of this will into the record, and then we'll discuss how to proceed." As she began reading the distribution details, 60% and the house to David, 20% to Michael, 15% to Jessica, 5% and jewelry to me, I watched my siblings' faces change. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to shock to what looked like calculation as he processed the financial implications. Jessica looked stunned, her mouth slightly open as she realized that Mom's decision was dramatically different from what we had all expected. But David's reaction was the most heartbreaking. As the judge read the details of his inheritance, his face crumpled with a mixture of guilt, grief, and overwhelming responsibility. He wasn't celebrating his good fortune. He was devastated by the burden Mom had placed on him and the rift it was creating in our family. When Judge Hawkins finished reading, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Jessica quietly crying. "Ms. Chen," the judge said, addressing me directly, "given that the will has now been produced and appears to be valid on its face, what is the basis for your challenge?" This was it. This was the moment where I had to accuse my brother of manipulation and argue that my mother's final wishes should be invalidated. Ms. Marsh had prepared me for this, but actually speaking the words felt like swallowing poison. "Your Honor, we believe that my brother David exerted undue influence over our mother during her final months. She was emotionally vulnerable due to grief over losing her best friend, and David took advantage of her concerns about his addiction and recovery to manipulate her into changing her will in his favor." The words came out sounding rehearsed and cold, even to my own ears. I could see David's face go pale as he realized I was accusing him of manipulating Mom during her final months when he had been working so hard to rebuild their relationship and prove his commitment to sobriety. "That's not true," David said quietly, his voice barely audible in the courtroom. "I would never. I loved Mom. I was just trying to show her that I was getting better." Judge Hawkins held up a hand. "Mr. Chen, you'll have an opportunity to respond through your attorney. Ms. Marsh, what evidence do you have to support this claim of undue influence?" Ms. Marsh presented our case methodically. She talked about David's increased contact with Mom in the months before the will was written. She highlighted the timing. The will was created just 2 months after Mom's best friend died, when she was grieving and emotionally vulnerable. She pointed out the dramatic departure from what would have been an equal distribution under intestacy law. But as she spoke, I could see that our case was weak. The evidence was all circumstantial, and Mom's letter explaining her reasoning undermined our argument that she had been manipulated. Ms. Marsh was doing her best with the materials I had given her, but even she seemed to realize that we were grasping at straws. Mrs. Rodriguez, representing my siblings, presented a devastating counter-argument. She had David's phone records showing that his calls to Mom were regular, but not excessive, and that many of them were initiated by Mom herself. She had testimony from Mom's doctor confirming that she was mentally sharp and not taking any medications that would affect her judgment. Most damaging of all, she had a statement from James Thompson describing Mom as emotional, but clearly competent when she drafted the will. Mrs. Chen was very thoughtful about her decisions, Thompson testified. She specifically asked me to include the explanatory letter because she anticipated that the distribution might cause family conflict. She wanted her children to understand her reasoning and to know that her decision was based on love, not favoritism. As the hearing progressed, I felt my case crumbling around me. But more than that, I felt the weight of what I was doing to my family. Michael was taking notes like he was preparing for his own legal battle. Jessica was crying quietly, devastated by the revelation of Mom's true feelings, and David looked like he was watching his world fall apart. During a recess, David approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. His eyes were red and his voice was shaking. "Sarah, why are you doing this to me? I know I've made mistakes, and I know I caused Mom a lot of worry over the years. But I never manipulated her. I never asked her for anything except the chance to prove I could stay clean. How can you think I would take advantage of her when she was grieving?" Standing there in that courthouse hallway, looking at my little brother's devastated face, I felt the full weight of my deception crashing down on me. David wasn't the manipulative person I had painted him as in my legal arguments. He was a young man who had struggled with addiction, but was genuinely trying to rebuild his life and his relationships. "I'm just trying to make sure Mom's wishes are honored," I said weakly. If she really wanted to leave you everything, then the will should stand up to scrutiny. But you don't believe that, do you? David said quietly. You think I manipulated her, or you think she wasn't thinking clearly, or you think the distribution is unfair. Which is it, Sarah? I couldn't answer him honestly, so I walked away. But his question haunted me as we returned to the courtroom for Judge Hawkins's decision. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. After reviewing the evidence presented today, I find that the will executed by Margaret Chen on April 18th, 2023, is valid and was created by a competent person acting of her own free will. There is insufficient evidence to support a claim of undue influence or lack of mental capacity. The will shall be admitted to probate, and distribution shall proceed according to its terms. I had lost months of planning, thousands of dollars in legal fees, and the destruction of my family relationships, all for nothing. But as I sat there listening to Judge Hawkins explain the next steps in the probate process, I realized that losing the legal battle was the least of my problems. The real consequences began immediately after the hearing. Michael confronted me in the courthouse parking lot, his corporate lawyer composure finally cracking. I can't believe you put us through this, Sarah. You hired a lawyer, filed court papers, and accused David of elder abuse without saying a word to any of us. What kind of person does that to their own family? I was trying to protect everyone, I said, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. Protect everyone from what? From Mom's actual wishes? From David getting help with his recovery? Or were you just trying to protect yourself from getting less money than you thought you deserved? Jessica was equally angry, but her anger was mixed with deep hurt. We trusted you, Sarah. We thought you were handling things for the family, but you were really just handling things for yourself. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been lying to us? But it was my final conversation with David that truly broke my heart. He found me sitting in my car after the others had left, still trying to process what had just happened. I need to ask you something, he said, getting into the passenger seat. And I need you to tell me the truth. I nodded, afraid of what was coming. You knew about the will before today, didn't you? That's why you weren't surprised by any of this. That's why you had a lawyer ready to challenge it. You found Mom's will months ago and decided to hide it from us. I wanted to lie one more time, to maintain the fiction that I had simply been investigating a suspicion. But looking at David's face, seeing the pain and betrayal in his eyes, I couldn't do it anymore. Yes, I whispered. I found it in October. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out the windshield at the gray Cleveland sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Why, Sarah? Why would you do that to us? Why would you let us plan for an equal inheritance when you knew it wasn't true? Why would you make us go through this in court? Because it wasn't fair, I said, finally telling the truth. Because I gave up everything to take care of Mom, and she left me almost nothing. Because you've struggled your whole adult life, and I didn't think you could handle that kind of responsibility. Because I thought I deserved better. So, you decided to play God with our family, David said. You decided that Mom's wishes didn't matter, that your judgment was better than hers, that you had the right to rewrite her will through the court system. I thought I was protecting everyone, I repeated, but even I didn't believe it anymore. David turned to look at me directly. You weren't protecting anyone, Sarah. You were just protecting yourself, and in the process, you've destroyed everything. He got out of the car and walked away, leaving me alone in the courthouse parking lot with the wreckage of my family, relationships scattered around me. The months that followed were the darkest of my life. The legal bills from Ms. Marsh consumed most of my savings. My siblings stopped including me in family communications, and our group text chain that had been active daily since Mom's death went silent. I had to return to teaching in the middle of the semester, explaining my absence with vague references to family legal matters. David did inherit the house and the majority of Mom's savings, just as she had intended. But the court battle had taken a toll on him too. The stress of being accused of manipulation, combined with the guilt of receiving so much while his siblings got so little, triggered a period of depression that threatened his sobriety. He moved into Mom's house but struggled with the isolation and the weight of responsibility that came with his inheritance. Jessica returned to Los Angeles and threw herself into her acting career, using her smaller inheritance to fund an independent film project. She rarely called, and when she did, our conversations were polite but distant. The warmth that had always characterized our relationship was gone, replaced by a formal courtesy that was somehow worse than outright anger. Michael was the most direct in expressing his feelings. "You've shown us who you really are, Sarah," he told me during our last conversation. "You're someone who will lie, deceive, and manipulate your own family for money. I don't want that kind of person in my life or around my children." I tried to repair the relationships. I wrote letters apologizing for my deception and explaining my reasoning. I offered to split my small inheritance among my siblings as a gesture of good faith. I begged for forgiveness and the chance to rebuild our family bonds. But some damage can't be undone. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. Some choices have consequences that extend far beyond what we imagine when we make them. 6 months after the court hearing, I received a text from David. It was a photo of him standing in Mom's garden, which he had been carefully maintaining. He was smiling, and he looked healthy and strong. The text said simply, 100 days clean. Mom would be proud. I stared at that photo for hours, realizing that David had not only handled his inheritance responsibly, but had used it as motivation to continue his recovery. Mom's instincts about her most vulnerable child had been correct. Her decision to provide him with security and stability had helped him build the life she had always hoped he could have. And I had almost destroyed that with my selfishness and my inability to trust her judgment. Today, almost a year later, I'm still dealing with the consequences of my choices. I live alone in my small apartment, having received my modest inheritance and Mom's jewelry as she intended. I have a decent job and a stable life, but I've lost the thing that mattered most: my family. David is thriving. He used some of his inheritance to go back to school and is studying to become a counselor for people struggling with addiction. He's been clean for over a year now, and he regularly volunteers at the rehabilitation center where he once sought treatment. He kept Mom's house and has turned it into a place where he hosts support group meetings for people in recovery. Jessica's film project was successful enough to launch her career to the next level, and she's been cast in several significant roles. Michael was promoted to partner at his law firm and has been focusing on his own family. They've all moved forward with their lives, while I remain stuck in the aftermath of my choices. I'm sharing this story not because I'm proud of what I did, but because I want others to understand the real cost of letting greed and resentment override family loyalty. I thought I was fighting for justice, but I was really just fighting for money. I thought I was protecting my family from an unfair decision, but I was really protecting myself from accepting that love and inheritance aren't the same thing. Mom's will wasn't about how much she loved each of us. It was about how much she understood each of us. She knew that Michael and Jessica had built successful, independent lives. She knew that I was strong enough to handle disappointment and financial challenges. And she knew that David needed security and stability more than any of us. Her decision was an act of love, even if it didn't feel fair to me at the time. I could have chosen to honor her wishes and trust her judgment. I could have chosen to support David in handling his inheritance responsibly. I could have chosen to maintain our family bonds instead of pursuing a legal battle that was ultimately pointless. Instead, I chose deception, manipulation, and selfishness. I chose to prioritize money over relationships, my judgment over Mom's, and my perceived fairness over family harmony. And I lost everything that really mattered. The inheritance money is gone now, spent on legal fees and living expenses. But the damage to my family relationships is permanent. I succeeded in overturning Mom's will in the sense that I forced it to be revealed and litigated in court. But I failed in every way that actually matters. If you're watching this video because you're facing a similar situation, please learn from my mistakes. Don't let grief and financial stress turn you into someone you don't recognize. Don't assume that love can be measured in dollars or that fairness always means equality. Don't sacrifice your family relationships for money that will eventually be spent and forgotten. Most importantly, don't underestimate the cost of deception. Every lie I told, every secret I kept, every manipulation I engaged in created distance between me and the people I loved most. By the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late to undo the damage. I hid my mom's will from my siblings, and I did overturn it in court in the sense that I forced a legal challenge that revealed its contents. But my victory was hollow, my methods were wrong, and the price I paid was far greater than any inheritance could ever be worth. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some choices can't be undone. Some families can't be repaired. This is one of those stories. But maybe, if my experience helps even one person make a different choice, then sharing it will have been worth the pain of reliving it. Money comes and goes. Family once lost may be gone forever. I learned that lesson too late.